Well, thank you very much. And this is really just to say that discussion of science and policy has decades of experience behind it, a very long history. My career, as Noel sort of suggested, has been very much around a knowledge broker between science and policy, and I've worked across loads of policy areas in my career, everything from waste management to pandemic flu, from MMR vaccines to air pollution, to now net zero and energy transitions. And what I'm about to say, I think, applies equally in every single policy area. So there's nothing particular about a topic area, or a sector, if you like, but I think the learnings are very familiar. For scientists, there's often real angst that all the science doesn't get translated into policy outcomes. So the question is, are we being realistic as scientists in that understanding? So just some few quotes just to show. Einstein got it back in 1936. Really, it's outside of the domain value judgments where policy actually has to interrupt in science interpretation. NERC, in its first guidance, I think 2009, on science into policy, our aim should be to provide information to allow policymakers to develop and properly assess policy options, not to push a particular line. And then Ian Boyd, who was DEFRA's CSA. I was on Science Advisory Council where Ian was CSA. My experience is that most policy decisions are informed to a greater or lesser extent by evidence, but rarely is it practical or desirable to base decisions entirely upon scientific evidence. So not pushing a particular line has been quite a strong element of advice. Peter Gluckman, who was CSA in New Zealand, trust in advice, absolutely essential. Ian again, when scientists start providing opinions about policies, they risk becoming politicized, and perhaps we need to examine what that means. And a politicized scientist cannot always be an independent scientist. And then if you really want to go back in history, Plato reminding us, however, that if we don't take an interest in politics, we're doomed to live under the rule of unworthy people. So there's that real classic dilemma of having to work in a politicized world, but keeping our science clean and trustworthy. Now, this is slightly unusual because, of course, this is an emergency situation, but this is the findings out of the Module 1 report of the COVID inquiry on resilience and preparedness, which went up to that sort of March period. And the 8 defects, these were identified by the scientists themselves taking part in that early part of the COVID pandemic. And what they felt as scientists providing advice. And much of this is my experience in all other areas, not just something like COVID. There was a huge difference here, as we saw, and we often saw on our screens, between the advisors to the government centrally and the devolved administrations. Scientists often felt constrained in the way they were given freedom to advise, and I'll say something about normative research a little bit later. They weren't getting feedback on the advice provided. There was huge overweighting towards biomedical science, and I've seen that myself in terms of the lack of social and economic and behavioral science that was going into advice and was involved in the Royal Society's work on non-pharmaceutical interventions, where we absolutely struggled to find any science at the time that was robust and wasn't just a review paper around how people would respond to non-pharmaceutical, i.e. Actually the sort of stay at home, the wear the masks type guidance, everything that wasn't vaccines. So huge lack of social science. A lack of coordination between multiple departments. There were 9 key scientific groups providing advice into multiple government departments. Advice not being commissioned at the right time. Groupthink, and I'll say a little bit more about this, absolute classic when you see scientific committees in work. It has huge benefits, but it can lead, if you're not careful, to groupthink. And then little challenge of the advice. So this is from the scientists actually providing the advice, and the ones that we often saw or heard on our screens during the early stages. And of course, in COVID, the science came from different areas. The language is we stick to the science, we stick to the evidence, but which? Was it the government science, which was largely health surveillance science, surveillance at scale? Was it the academic science, whether it was on vaccines and diagnostics, non-pharmaceuticals, but where, as I say, was the social and economic virtually non-existent? And where was the industrial science, which was around the scaling up of ideas and making them available at pace? So we had these different elements of science with a different purpose. But the question is COVID just an exception? Well, I don't think it is, in my experience. And how can we make science policy a very constructive mix? Now, don't try and read all of this, but I do... This is a book about to come out by C.M. Boyd, Science and Politics. I think it comes out later this month. It's a brilliant read. They asked me wonderfully to review it, and provide one of the reviews, and it's a fabulous read. It doesn't hold back on the punches in terms of what goes on inside the science and politics factory. And we are talking here, of course, about government central policy, and I think Michael's drawing out of what local government does is really quite interesting, and the divergence between what happens in local government, which of course is also a political structure, and what happens at central government is a really interesting question to explore. But basically this is the view of a CSA who is having to conduct science for policy making, and as a member of SAC, we felt that very particular. Scientists like to see ourselves as impartial and independent, but we of course have ideological views. We are citizens at the end of the day. We all have our own values and beliefs in what's right and what's wrong. And of course, sometimes we're funded by particular people. There are a very complex mix of risks and benefits which have to be considered, and of course our evidence is just one input. Much research is commissioned by those who solve immediate problems rather than fundamental problems, and I think as a later one, there are piles of research reports in government filing cabinets which have never ever been used. Some of those got my name on as editor because I know that stuff goes in and never ever gets used because it's not quite at the right time for being used, or occasionally it didn't say the right thing they wanted to know. And I have had one report once in my life which never will see the light of day because they didn't like the answer that we were giving them. And actually working on DEFRA SAC, areas like bovine TB, when we provided a final set of advice for a political decision about what to do, the science had not changed in 10 years. The science was exactly the same answers, but the political decisions changed from one minister to another based on the particular political view. And as we sat with Ian deciding what to do, he very wisely said, we will just tell them our findings, what they do with it, we can't really influence. And so that politics factory is really important to understand. You might all engage with policy makers in different government departments, but you will be acutely aware that what they do with the evidence is then politically influenced. So we have to package our science, aware of the audience, and we have to package it in a way if we want it to be used. Now, my life has been spent in the science around communication and engagement, and I think it's particularly relevant to areas of clean air at the moment, and had some discussion last night around indoor air pollution. This is absolutely going to be a really difficult area to tackle, and it absolutely requires public engagement as to likely to see what behavioural change you could achieve. And so most of the science has been around perceptions, behaviour change, communication effectiveness, and very much the role of deliberative processes. And way back in 2003, this feels like ancient history to me now, did a piece of work when I was here at Birmingham for Department of Health called Risk Literacy, and we looked at air pollution messages at the time, and there was a wonderful little leaflet produced by DETR. Remember them? So, no, most of you are far too young to remember who DETR were, deafer in current language, but wonderful little brief sort of booklet directed to the public of what to do about air pollution. And it was absolute classic science, hazard, pathway, risk. And that's not how most ordinary people think. You know, that's how those of us trained in certain sciences think. And I can remember running a group here at the university with some teenagers who all had asthma or other bronchial conditions, showing them this leaflet, which of course they'd never seen in their life, although it was written for them. It said, you know, if you hear an air pollution message which says, stay at home and you suffer from asthma, please stay at home. And one lovely young man sat there and said, if I've got a hot date, there's no way I'm staying at home. Which just wonderfully, you know, summed up how people deal with information and then place it in their real-world lives. And so this was completely useless information. It wasn't going to change anyone's behaviour whatsoever. And I have to say, at the same time, this project had MMR vaccines in. I won't go into that now, but that's a whole different story as well. So how do we get science in deliberative processes, which is what we've moved to, and into policy-enabling tools? Some may be aware of ScienceWise programs. 20 years now of this program, started in 2004, and I was hugely privileged to be on the first advisory group and chaired the final steering group before it moved back into UKRI and DCIT. And this is from Angela, who's the current CSA, and this idea that we mustn't talk to people about science. We have to think about what the messaging means for them and how to provide a degree of trustworthiness in those messages. And that leads to a very different mechanism of engaging with people. And then Jack Stilgo reminding us that science is far too important to be left to scientists, and that the public voice is absolutely crucial. So what ScienceWise has been doing is running a whole suite of deliberative processes. They are expensive, they're not quick, but they are designed at finding out why people think things, not just what they think. That Ipsos Mori survey where you tick boxes and you get thousands of answers, but you've no idea why people actually ticked the boxes. Deliberative processes are directed to why people think as they do. And ScienceWise has been running vast number, I think, let me just check 75 public dialogues over 20 years, never one on air pollution or clean air. And I find that immensely interesting, that no government department, because government department are asking for these to be done, has asked for that to be done. So if you want to, you know, make a call for something, I would suggest this is a topic. So the current dialogues, for example, have been asked for by the Climate Change Commission in the setting of the 7th carbon reduction budget, and understanding public views on how to balance off different policy packages which might be available. UKRI are currently just finished one on future flight, which has asked for public views on using new forms of energy, electric and hydrogen for flight, thinking about what that means to them and indeed what is socially desirable, potential outcomes for future flight. In recent years, we've seen ones on stem cells, on embryo models, and we've seen, I've been involved in ones on energy, I've been involved in ones in biotechnology, in a vast range of topics, never ever clean air. And I really challenge government departments to answer why. The problem with, we did one on bovine TB when I was on SAC. The problem is that these aren't cheap or quick, but they're so illuminating into what people actually think. You run them in a very scientific method. These are robust methods that sit behind them. You get independent oversight. You ensure a whole range of views around the table. You have public and experts actually deliberating together over time, often weeks, on the ethical and social issues raised by the science. You have public involved in balancing off tensions and trade-offs in policies which might be needed. You get public views and different perspectives, different areas of public. You have tailored feedback into the government departments, and of course you have an independent evaluation as to how it worked and whether it didn't. So there are multiple examples of these, and do go on the ScienceWise website if you've never seen, because there's some great reports. So the UKRI and the research councils before have been providing extensive guidance for scientists on how to engage with the public and how to engage with policy. And with language like, make sure you're talking to the right person. Well, my experience, they change every couple of years, so it's quite hard work sometimes. Building productive long-term relationships, again, can be quite difficult. There's now great funded policy fellowships, placement schemes. Royal Society, of course, has run the MP pairing scheme for many years. There are knowledge brokers with institutions which help to bring the scientists and researchers close into a policy world and to help them to navigate those routes through. And then, of course, you've got to make your science understood and read. 45 years ago now, probably a bit longer, my first great scientific report that I was so proud of went to the Health and Safety Executive, and they then seconded me for a year to work inside. And the first thing they said, could you reduce this to 2 pages? It was 65 pages long. I was devastated. And I can remember being devastated, but it had a real impact on me. So if you can write in 2 pages, you've got it sussed. And then we have seen new forms of policy making, what might be called adaptive policy making. And low emission zones are a good example of that, where you actually have an opportunity, and of course this was a judiciary intervention to require action, setting up zones across multiple cities and therefore being able to evaluate and measure over time, replicating a large-scale, long-term experiment and seeing policy making change and adapt in relation to the science. So we don't see this very often, but I think here, for air quality in particular, it's been a quite useful, and we're still, of course, measuring and using those zones and seeing what happens. But there are tensions around those zones as well, and there are social tensions around those zones. So, if you want to claim you're impartial and your science is essential, be very careful when you do it, because we have to say what we don't know all the time. All science is based on error, and we all know that. Multiple forms of error in our science, and we have to be absolutely open on all of that. Normative research, where you start with the answer and work back in the science to find evidence to back up the policy desire, is not unusual. It is attractive because sometimes it means we can do consultancy projects for government departments and earn more than, earn 100% of the full economic cost as opposed to only 65% if you come out the research councils. So it's very attractive to do this type of research, but we have to be wary of what we do when we take it on. I've done multiple bits like that. There are multiple evidence strands required for most complex policy areas. There is no one scientific area that will provide answers to multiple and complex policy areas. Your academic paper, know how brilliant it is, and I know everyone has 4-star papers in REF, I mean it's just standard, of course, that is never ever sufficient to have impact. You have to work if you want to have policy impact. You have to understand your policy audience, how they tick, what they need, and you, of course, have to maintain your scientific credibility at the same time, and none of us would give up on that. And as Ian, I know himself, has said, as a science advisor, you have to continue to champion open science and scientific freedoms, but at the same time understand how your science may or may not be used. And so this is a complex area. It hasn't changed, and there is a distinct difference between government policy and local policy making. And understanding the distinctions between those, which we haven't got time to go in today, but I think it interestingly came out in Michael's local authority responses. They are nearer to the ground, they are nearer to understanding their local situation. They will be lacking in money, that's absolutely clear, but you can have more impact sometimes locally than at the national level. But anyway, just some thoughts. Thank you.